Once again, this is Busch History Land, and this is topic 23, the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement in American history has many waypoints, many important events. And the Civil Rights Movement also, we tend to think about it in terms of African American rights. And while that might be where the focus is, we can't ever forget that we're also talking about women's rights. We're talking about the rights of the disabled. We're talking about Latin American rights and Mexican rights. And we're talking about gay rights as well. So we tend to say the Civil Rights Movement specifically pointing at African American rights and at Martin Luther King and company. And while that might be where the majority of the focus is, we can't forget that it includes other organizations as well. That being said, today's representation will be primarily on the African American aspect of the Civil Rights Movement. Where exactly does the Civil Rights Movement begin? A lot of people point to Brown in 1954. I'll go into more details about that. Some people talk about Rosa Parks, and that's 1955. You can go back earlier to Congress on Racial Equality, and that goes back to about 1942. You can go to the NAACP, which goes back to roughly 1913, plus or minus, started by W.E.B. Du Bois, or Dubois. And it's an interesting question, because realistically, civil rights goes back to the beginning of the United States, and we all know the whole idea of slavery at this point in time, and we understand the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of slaves as a result of that, the 13th Amendment. And prior to Brown, we have the whole idea of Plessy, which established the now infamous doctrine of separate but equal. And then we have major events in the Civil Rights Movement. We certainly have the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which occurs as a result of Rosa Parks not giving up her seat on the bus. We will have the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 1963. There are significant assassinations. There are significant boycotts and protests. Letters from a Birmingham jail kind of lays out the goals of the Civil Rights Movement in its entirety. So there's really a lot to take a look at. With that idea in mind, I just want to start with a quick overview, and then we'll go into more specific details. The high watermark of the Civil Rights Movement is really in the 1950s and the 1960s. And we have four distinct images here. The image in the upper left-hand corner is the Little Rock incident in 1957 at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Certainly we have Dr. King, we have Malcolm X, and we have Rosa Parks. And the question is, why does it happen in the post-war years? Why does the Civil Rights Movement really take off at that time? Well, there are a lot of possible reasons. One of them, frankly, is that so many African Americans had gone off to fight in a segregated military, and they come home to the United States and they're facing discrimination once again. There was a baby boom, there was a lot of movement. A lot of blacks had gained significant job status during the war, filling in for white soldiers, for example, and it was time to move forward. This whole idea of separate but equal had been discussed and discussed and discussed as Plessy versus Ferguson. And can you ever have separate and equal? Well, instead of going through this entire PowerPoint, which will be on my website, I want to go through these ideas one at a time. Let me set that up, and I'll be right with you. I have rather a lengthy list of key people and terms in the Civil Rights Movement. They're not in chronological order, and that's on purpose. There's a worksheet on the website that lists these items, and what I really want people to do is to research them and not just find the timeline someplace, although, by the way, there is a timeline in the folder. It just, don't look at it right away, because it's better to piece these things together. Anyway, This is all available in bushhistory.net in the Topic 23 folder, which is Civil Rights. Let's get started here. So we have Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education is very much the granddaddy of all of these cases and issues for the modern civil rights movement. Little Linda Brown, the case is well known, was told she had to go to an all-black school that was quite a distance from her house, and there was a white school within a block of her house, and her parents asked the NAACP to get involved. Now, as it turned about at the time, there were several cases. There was one in Darlington County, I believe that's in North Carolina, it could be South Carolina, I don't want to be wrong on that one. But in either case, there was one out in the Midwest as well, and they all dealt with the same thing, and it was thought that a small girl was very sympathetic, and that would be the case to use. So lead attorney Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP said, let's put these together into an omnibus suit, omni meaning many, and they brought suit and they managed it through the courts until they got to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1954. And Earl Warren had been appointed to the court and appointed Chief Justice partway through the process, and President Eisenhower had told Earl Warren, regardless of what happens, I want this decision to be unanimous. And what's happening here was the question of separate but equal, the Plessy decision in 1896. Can you have separate and equal? Because what happened was, during this time period, school districts were starting to comply. They were starting to try to make their facilities equal to avoid the Supreme Court deciding the separate but equal is unconstitutional. So Eisenhower wanted a unanimous decision that it wasn't whether they could make facilities equal, it was whether, if they were separate, they would ever be equal. And the NAACP came up with a very compelling way of proving that separate was never equal. And they did it with something called the doll experiment. They established some child care centers throughout the South, and they invited children to come to the child care centers, and in these child care centers they had black dolls and white dolls for children to play with. And then they watched what would happen, what these children would do. And again, the children took the white dolls. And before the children left, at the end of the day, or at the end of the time period in the daycare center, the children were asked, why did you choose one doll over the other? And again, the children, these were black children, the black children said, because white is better. Now, if that's the case, if that actually goes that way, then separate but equal is completely flawed, because regardless of what has happened, black children never feel equal, and they feel that white is better. So after some technical issues, to finish up the point, the black students are turning around and saying, the black children turn around and saying that white is better. And if white is better, then they are never feeling equal to the white children. Because if they're black and they're picking the white dolls, and they're saying the white dolls are better than black dolls, then inferiority is now ingrained, and the education system is failing them. So anyway, as a result of this, the Supreme Court decides, in a unanimous decision, Earl Warren got it for Eisenhower, that separate could never be equal when it comes to public education. And you take a look at a YouTube feed of this, there's a link right on the bottom. So then we move along, shortly on the heels, to Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks. I was taught that Rosa Parks was an innocent woman who had simply refused to give up her seat. Well, not quite the case. Rosa Parks was a secretary and a sometime activist of the NAACP. And people who worked for the NAACP were told that when the opportunity arose, that they should try to resist these segregation and discrimination laws. And that actually is what happened with Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks, while not going and necessarily looking for the altercation, was prepared when it came her way. And then we all know the story. She refused to give up her seat to a white patron on the bus, and she was arrested for it. And that is the big thing that we tend to think of in the early civil rights movement, besides Brown. And that kicks off the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which is going to go on for an entire year. Then there are some very heart-wrenching moments in the early civil rights movement. And one of them is Emmett Till. Again, these are not in order, and that's on purpose. This is in August of 1964. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy, and he was visiting his relatives in Mississippi from Chicago. And as the story goes, he whistled at a white girl as she walked by. Well, Emmett Till was then kidnapped, and he was horribly murdered as a result of that. And when it came to his funeral, his mother insisted that there be an open casket so the world can know what happened to her son. And he became a poster child, if you like, for the violence that was part of the whole white supremacy movement during the civil rights movement and the anti-black feelings. So Emmett Till is firmly ingrained in history, and his mother's bold move to have that open casket really seared an impression of the violence that was part of all of this. Next we have Dr. King. You can't talk about the civil rights movement without talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was the face and the voice and the heart behind the civil rights movement. Gains fame during the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955 and 1956. He started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that was a group of Southern clergymen who were going to use peaceful, nonviolent methods to resist discrimination. The high water for Dr. King is his I Have a Dream speech, which is what this link is to. Those words still echo today in American society, as whenever we hear of Dr. King, we always think of that famous speech. And that entire speech, by the way, is available following that link. The NAACP. The NAACP, the civil rights movement is nothing without the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But this goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century with Webb Du Bois. And Webb Du Bois starts this just as what it sounds like, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's the early organized civil rights organization for African Americans, and it leads the way in the Brown case. Morgan versus Virginia is an earlier case, before Brown, before Rosa Parks, and it's testing segregation on public interstate commerce. Morgan versus Virginia, 1946. Irene Morgan is going on a bus from Virginia to Baltimore, and the bus is a segregated bus, and she's going to be arrested for violating the segregation law. She was ordered to sit in the back of the bus, as Virginia state law required. And she said, no, this is interstate commerce, this is an interstate bus, I shouldn't have to. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to decide in her favor, because in 1945, segregation on interstate transportation had been banned in the United States. And because we're going between two states, between Virginia and Maryland, she didn't think it applied, and she was ultimately correct. CORE is the Congress on Racial Equality. Look at the date on this, it's 1942. And CORE is basically what it sounds like. It's a think tank activist group to try and explore ways for African Americans to increase their status and get past discrimination in the United States. And that starts all the way back during World War II in 1942. We have to talk about Jackie Robinson, how brave a person he was in 1947, where Branch Rickey brings him up to play Major League Baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It was probably the Brooklyn Dollars as well. The Brooklyn Dodgers. And Jackie Robinson was chosen for a number of reasons. He was chosen because he had incredible skill as a baseball player. He was also chosen because it was thought that he had the personality to stand up to the insults and the slurs that were going to be fired at him without fighting back. And that was very important, because if this experiment was going to work, it was going to work by him showing his class and his internal strength. And it did work. Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche, or Ralph Bunche, depends on who you ask. He was the first African American to win the Nobel Prize. He interceded in the Middle East conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And he becomes a leader in the civil rights movement. Now he's gained a great deal of status as a result. He's a political scientist, a very well-schooled man. And by being the first African American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, he really elevated the status of African Americans. The Southern Manifesto in 1956 is a reaction to Brown. A group of Southern congressmen, 101 to be precise, got together and wrote this manifesto stating that they were never going to give in to the Brown decision and they were going to uphold segregation. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court for the Brown decision, and he was the one that was able to successfully deliver the unanimous decision that President Eisenhower wanted. As a result of the Brown decision, 3 years later we're going to get Little Rock. Now, an important thing to understand about the Brown decision is there are actually two Brown decisions. Brown in 1954 said that separate but equal had no place in the American Constitution and was outlawed. But it didn't tell states they had to integrate, and states did nothing because the Supreme Court does not legislate. It decides on legislation, whether legislation is constitutional or not. So in 1955, a year later, seeing nothing had been done, the Supreme Court turned around and did something that's called judicial activism and ordered southern states to integrate with all possible speed or all foreseeable haste, and they still resisted. So in 1957, we're going to get the big test case of all of this, and this is going to be Little Rock, the Little Rock 9 in 1957. Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas was a large high school, is a large high school in Little Rock. And the NAACP chose 9 students, 9 volunteers with exemplary academic records to integrate Central High School. And after a heated debate, the school board of Little Rock says, well, we have to do this. The Supreme Court said we have to integrate. There's nothing we can do about this. And they voted to allow the students to enter the school in September of 1957. Of course, you know it wasn't going to be that easy, because Governor Orville Falbus, who was an adamant segregationist, and he also had a pretty long history as a successful politician in the South, said, no, we're not going to allow them into school. And he took the National Guard. Remember, the National Guard are local soldiers, and he denied them entry into Little Rock High School. President Eisenhower wasn't going to let this one go. So he takes that same National Guard and he federalizes them. And he says now those same soldiers that stopped them have now got to help them get into the school. And you can understand the local conflict about this. And then the 82nd Airborne is brought down to Little Rock as well to help deal with crowd control. So now you have the local National Guard, you have the 82nd Airborne, you have Governor Falbus, and you have President Eisenhower, all nose to nose, eyeball to eyeball. And the funny thing about it is, it goes on with relatively little violence. There was pushing and shoving in the crowds. That certainly did occur. There were a lot of ethnic slurs and racial slurs being thrown around. That certainly occurred as well. But the students went there. The students went there, and for most of the year, they got along. They got along, and Little Rock and the rest of the United States survived it. But Governor Falbus was not going to let this one go. Because what does he do? The next year, he closes the schools in Arkansas. He closes the public schools in Arkansas, and all students are now going to have to go to private or religious schools, which in essence says the black children are going to go to the black church schools, and the white children are going to go to the white church schools, and now the Constitution really can have nothing to do with it at that time. We kind of just covered Governor Orville Falbus. It is an interesting name as well, so it's an easy one to remember. And it's a classic states' rights versus the United States government case. Now, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, remember, this is a direct result of the Rosa Parks incident. It goes on for better than a year, 381 days, and Martin Luther King's idea here was, instead of having violent confrontation, he would hit Montgomery where it hurt the most, in its wallet. And by black people not going on the buses in Montgomery, it would hurt the city, and it would force the city to change. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is just what I was talking about a few minutes ago. This is the group of Southern ministers who are going to lead the Montgomery Bus Boycott and be influential throughout the rest of the civil rights movement. In Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, 1960, this is the famed sit-in at Woolworth's. For those of you who are too young to know what Woolworth's was, think of the lunch counter in a Kmart. A Woolworth's and a Kmart was similar. Kmart is larger than Woolworths, and Woolworths used to be called the Five and Dime store. It was a small general merchandise store, but there was a chain of them throughout the United States. And they had a lunch counter, and people would go and get hot dogs and grilled cheese and hamburgers and stuff like that. Either case, in Greensboro, in February 1960, a group of local activists from local college decide to sit down right in front of where it says whites only at the counter. And they're not served. And they stay all day, and they keep coming back. And national attention is drawn upon the situation, at Greensboro. And you also see white patrons doing things like pouring pudding and soup on their heads and calling them nigger and stuff like that. It was horrible. It was horrible. And it brought great attention. And the situation grew, and the amount of participants grew, and we have the whole sit-in movement that comes out of this. And the sit-in movement is coordinated by the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And once again, they're pledging nonviolence. It was believed by Dr. King and his allies that the only way that the civil rights movement was going to work was by giving the white supremacists as little fuel as possible in their argument that African Americans and whites could not coexist. Stokely Carmichael was one of the early leaders of the SNCC. He didn't necessarily see eye to eye with the nonviolent perspective, but the SNCC largely stayed true to that. In 1961, we have freedom rides. Freedom rides were an attempt to test segregation laws on transportation in the South, and in 1961, a group of northern blacks and whites get on these buses, and they're going to drive through the South on these buses. Well, it doesn't go very well. It doesn't go very well because the buses are stopped, and people are taken off the buses, and the buses are set on fire, but on national television. So now, discrimination has a face, and that face is seen across all of the states. And that really is going to ignite this public outrage in the civil rights movement. We have the Albany movement, and the Albany movement is a largely failed but early attempt to end discrimination as a result of this conference in Albany, Georgia. James Meredith becomes another poster child in the civil rights movement because he's going to attempt successfully to integrate the University of Mississippi in 1962. And he does. He gets away with it. He goes to the University of Mississippi, and he's accepted there in his all-white school, and he is the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi. Letters from a Birmingham jail. If you want to think of this as a civil rights manifesto, that would not be incorrect. As a result of riots that were going on in Birmingham, Dr. King is arrested and he's put in jail. A group of white clergymen from Birmingham write an op-ed, an opinion editorial article in the local paper, asking for peace and asking for calm, and they're not pro-segregation, they're just asking Martin Luther King and his allies to slow down and wait, that in time things will get better. Well, Dr. King gets a copy of this while he's in the Birmingham jail, and Letter from Birmingham jail is a response to that editorial as to why we can't wait and why now. Why we can't wait is the quote, that we've waited long enough. It's time for change, and it becomes the manifesto for that civil rights movement. August 28, 1963 is best known for the I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington, because that is the date of that speech. And interestingly enough, John Kennedy allowed that to occur. He allowed that march to occur. And it isn't but August, September, October, November, 3 months later, on November 22nd, 1963, that John Kennedy is assassinated, giving fuel to the belief that some have that John Kennedy was assassinated as a result of allowing Dr. King to make that speech. Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers is an early civil rights leader who is murdered in Jackson, Mississippi as he's coming home from work at the NAACP. He is killed in his driveway while his children are watching and his wife is looking out the window. A very poignant moment. Governor George Wallace. Governor George Wallace is famous for his quote, In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And once again, if you go to this YouTube link, you'll actually see him say that. He actually runs for president 4 times. And he gets a significant following as an ardent segregationist. He is ultimately shot in an attempted assassination on George Wallace, and George Wallace spends the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And towards the end of his life, he gets religion, so to speak, and he recants on some of the early evils of his life and his pro-segregationist point of view. The Birmingham Riots, May of 1963. There are KKK bombings in Birmingham, Alabama, at significant civil rights locations and homes of civil rights leaders. And that leads to the Birmingham Riots. And now we have federal troops sent in to face local law enforcement officials. The local law enforcement officials are trying to quell the violence, and they are going after the blacks. Federal troops are coming in, just trying to stop the violence and stopping the local law officials from victimizing the blacks. Imagine how tough that was. Bloody Sunday, March 27, 1965, there had been voting drives throughout the South, and there was a march planned to go from Selma to Montgomery, Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And in order to prevent the entry of civil rights leaders from getting into Montgomery, they were met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by local law enforcement, and a riot developed. And I have to tell you, the riot was one-sided. It was really the law enforcement officials using billy clubs against, and water cannons and the like, against the protesters who were simply marching peacefully. It becomes known as Bloody Sunday. In the middle of all of this, we have a writer, Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington writes something called The Other America. And in this book, he, in a very poignant way, he talks about the disparity amongst poverty-ridden people in the United States from the haves versus the have-nots. And he does interviews, and it's very poignant, and people realize the depth of this divide, of this chasm. And it's not just black-white, because that would be too easy for him to do. It was a lot of black society and a lot of poor white society as well. And that's going to spur the Great Society movement of Lyndon Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1954, July of 1964, and this is on the heels of the Kennedy assassination. There was a lot of legislation passed shortly after John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, I don't want to say took advantage of the public mood, but he wanted to make sure that Kennedy's legacy was fulfilled, and he moved forward a lot of the Kennedy-era legislation. The most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It prohibits discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, and religion. Very, very big deal. Then we get to 24th Amendment. Also in January of 1964, the 24th Amendment allows the Civil Rights Act to be upheld. Basically, it abolishes poll taxes. Poll taxes were just what they sound like. You had to pay a tax to vote throughout many southern states, and because a lot of black society was part of that. Michael Harrington's The Other America, and they were poor. They couldn't afford to pay this poll tax, so it effectively stopped them from voting. The EEOC, first established by John Kennedy with an executive order, and then actually made part of the federal government as a result of the 24th Amendment. Basically, it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it's going to be in charge of overseeing integration in public employment and overseeing something called affirmative action, which is making sure that employers who use public funds in any way, shape, or form make a concerted effort to hire African Americans. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the national origins quota. Going all the way back into the 1920s, immigration laws had favored Europeans over Asians. Well, this is going to change as a result of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, because it abolishes national origins quotas. And that's going to be a good thing. Some people believe this is a result of the Cultural Revolution in Maoist China. There's some logic behind that, but it goes much bigger than that. The Watts Riot. Talk about something coming from nothing in terms of an incident. The Watts area of Los Angeles was a poverty-stricken black area. where there was a lot of tension during the civil rights era and a lot of tension between law enforcement and the black residents of the area. Well, a black policeman pulled over, excuse me, a white policeman pulled over a black man for driving while intoxicated. Well, while the driver was there being questioned by the policeman, the passenger went about a block away to get the driver's mother, because the driver was a young man. The mother comes back and starts yelling at her son for driving while intoxicated, basically saying, you know, you can't do this, you can't give the authorities reason to single you out. And a crowd develops. And a crowd develops, and violence develops from that crowd, and pretty soon we have the Watts Riots. And it went on, if you take a look, from August 11th to August 17th, 1965. The Watts area of Los Angeles was on fire, and troops had to be brought in to quell the violence. Malcolm X. Malcolm X. Well, if you have Martin Luther King wanting nonviolent means, you have Malcolm X saying, by all means necessary. Malcolm X is a very well-educated civil rights leader who speaks very well along the lines of how Martin Luther King spoke as well. But he believes that we should not just take it, that black society should stand up. He believes in equality by all means necessary. And he becomes a spokesman and an early believer in the Black Power movement. And once again, I have a YouTube link, you can actually see Malcolm X. And the interesting thing about Malcolm X, he becomes disenchanted with the Nation of Islam, the group that he belonged to and represented, and he found how they were misusing money for their own personal gain. And before he could expose them, he's assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes it easier for Southern blacks to register to vote. Literacy tests and grandfather clauses and stuff like that are now illegal. So now most barriers, other than the obvious fear of violence, have been removed from African Americans voting in the United States. The Black Panthers are a Marxist socialist organization. They believe in the equality and the division of wealth that Karl Marx talked about, and they're also a Black Power organization. And they want to forcibly take wealth and redistribute it. And they are kind of along the lines of the Malcolm X school, by all means necessary. These guys wore black leather, they walked around with their black berets, and they carried weapons around their soldiers. They were very, very threatening in the presence they created. There's a famous scene in the Forrest Gump movie where he comes and says, "I'm sorry I broke up your Black Panther Party." Well, that's basically what we're looking at here. Founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and their ideas continued throughout most of the 1960s. Executive Order 11246, President Johnson issues this order which enforces affirmative action for the first time. Affirmative action then and now is controversial. Should one group be given preference over another group simply because of the color of their skin? Well, in the 1960s it was thought that was the case because blacks had been denied opportunity for so long in the United States that the only way to approach a step towards equality was to now swing the pendulum the other way. So what happened was blacks would be given preference on civil service exam. A certain amount of points would be added if you were an African American. If you wanted public housing, a certain amount of apartments had to be set aside for public housing. If you wanted to go to a public university, a certain amount of slots would have to be set aside for African Americans. Very, very controversial, especially in today's society where some people believe it's not necessary any longer, that people should make their way based on their own merit. Recently upheld in the Supreme Court with the Bush administration going after the state of Michigan and the University of Michigan specifically for their use of affirmative action, but it is still a policy in the United States to this day. Thurgood Marshall, he is the lead attorney in the Brown case, in Brown versus Board of Education from the NAACP. He is also the first black man appointed to the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson in 1967. And he has a very long tenure. Take a look, 1967, 77, 87 to 1991. He is there a very, very long time. Loving versus Virginia in 1967. This is Richard Loving versus Virginia. The Lovings were a biracial couple. She was black, he was white. And it was against the law in Virginia for a biracial couple to get married. Well, they go to the Supreme Court over this. And the Supreme Court rules prohibiting interracial marriage is unconstitutional. And it caused several states, 16 to be exact, to change their laws as a result of that. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. Because one thing about an insidious idea of like racism is that it finds a way to keep showing its ugly face again. A teacher I had in college, a professor I had once in college, compared it to water on a leaky roof. Water on a leaky roof will find a way to get into the house. Well, racism in a society where it's not being allowed in more and more cases will still find a way to seep in. So now, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is going to prohibit discrimination in housing. So now, your race can have nothing to do with whether you get a mortgage or not. And I have to tell you, when I bought my first house in 1985, I had a real estate agent specifically steer me away from neighborhoods with African American populations. She showed me a map and said, well, I can't do this legally, but take a look at this map. And this map showed racial breakdowns in a city in the United States, which I'm not going to mention here, and said, well, consider carefully where you want to live. And I was appalled and walked out that you actually pull something like this. So racism finds a way. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. This is very, very controversial because this is going to be how do we enforce integration? Well, schools have been doing something called busing. Busing was taking students from a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood, bringing them to a central location, and then having students from the black buses get off and get onto the white buses, and students from the white buses get off and get onto the black buses, and then take those buses to schools, thereby forcing you, if you lived in one part of town, to go completely to the other side of town to integrate that school. And students ended up spending a long period of time on buses, and people were very upset by it. There were more white families that were upset than black families because the white children in their white neighborhoods were now going to the black neighborhood schools. That's not to say that blacks weren't upset as well. This was tough on everybody. And what we have here is 1971 upholds busing as a legitimate means for achieving integration of public schools. Violent altercations as far north as Boston and Denver, Colorado as a result of this. But nevertheless, it moved integration forward. And even today, while we have dominant neighborhoods where we have African Americans and whites, we still have people going to these schools in the opposing neighborhoods. So busing, while tough, was a means to an end. A lot of this is available on this infoplease.com website, and certainly all of it is available on my website at buschhistory.net. And there's a link to that in the PowerPoint presentation. And there's also, if you take a look at the very beginning of this, when I get there, yeah, we'll get there, we have www.buschhistory.net. I just want to walk through a brief timeline with you right now, so hold on one second. This is a timeline, key events in the American Civil Rights Movement. It takes a lot of what I just presented to you and walks it through going all the way back to the 14th Amendment and moving forward. We have Brown, we have the Southern Manifesto, we have Little Rock just as examples, letters from Birmingham jail, Governor Wallace, the bombing of the Birmingham church, and there are some things in here that are not in my example, and that's simply because I missed them. I can't remember everything, but here's a timeline nevertheless where you can put these things in order and see some of the cause and effect relationships, also available on the website. I have some images to just briefly share with you. This is the Greensboro lunch counter, Woolworths, where we have the Greensboro sit-in in February of 1960. This is part of the PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to go through the whole presentation because a lot of the material echoes what I just did with the peoples and terms, but I wanted to show it to you nevertheless. Down here, we have John Kennedy meeting Dr. King. We have Robert Kennedy. And when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, in April of 1968, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was running for president, but that's not my point. The point is that Bobby Kennedy was such a hero in the civil rights movement as well. He really was a proponent of Dr. King, that he was probably the only person at the time who could solve the violence and stop the violence that occurred as a result of Dr. King's assassination. Over here, we have Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, as I said, is the lead attorney for the NAACP, and he is also the first black Supreme Court justice. One of the things I don't do is dwell on the assassinations that occur during the civil rights movement. Yes, they're violent, yes, they're ugly, and yes, they show the worst part of some people in the United States. I'd rather dwell on the successes of the civil rights movement. Yes, I am well aware that April 1968, Dr. King is assassinated. And James Earl Ray was arrested for it, and then he recanted, and Coretta Scott King believed that he did not do it. I'm well aware of that. I prefer not to deal with that in this presentation. As I said, I prefer to deal with the successes. We have Malcolm X. Yes, I know he was assassinated in 1965. We have Rosa Parks. We have the Little Rock Nine. These are all important events in the civil rights movement. But you could also argue that the civil rights movement continues even today. It continues today in all of us. It continues today when each one of us turns around and says, no, I am not going to take the unfair treatment of anyone based on anything that makes them different from me. People should be judged on their own merits, not the color of their skin, not their physical disability, not their sexual preference, and not their ethnic origin. So each one of us today that continues to try to fight the fight and continues to try to live the dream of a nation with equality based on who you are and the content of your character and not the color of your skin, continues to fight the civil rights battle. I continue to see examples that bother me in the United States today, and I continue to wonder why. However, I will tell you, I was a small child during the civil rights movement. I don't remember the incidents well. I remember seeing some things on TV. I remember my parents saying, David, watch this. This is important. But I'd be hard-pressed to tell you I felt it then. So I do what I can now. I do what I can now, as each one of you can do. Either way, I'd rather leave it there for now and not go on preaching about this. We all know the importance of all of this. All of the information that I presented to you today is available at bushhistory.net in topic 23, and I will update the website shortly with all that information for you. Take a look at it. Take a look at the rest of the information on the website. Take a look at the Bush History videos. There are many of them now. I continue to get emails and letters and asking me questions, and that's great, and I like getting those letters, or the emails I should say. A little dating myself on letters there, but sometimes the only date I can get. But anyway, continue to send the emails, and I will continue to answer them. Take a look at the website, and if anybody has any suggestions on how I can improve all of this, please let me know. I am going to make a better website for next year. It's a little antiquated right now, and I will get to that. Anyway, for now, this is David Busch from Bush History. You gotta like the bright pink shirt. The weather's getting better. And wishing you a great day, and I will see you soon.